punishment. Right? It's an even greater thing. If that was true, then you have no hope of escaping punishment. And the author's warning them about the danger of being apathetic toward the gospel by telling them there are catastrophic consequences associated with that course of action. If you ignore it, you're apathetic toward it, you drift from it, well, there are catastrophic consequences. And the word spoken by angels, I say that's a reference to the Mosaic Law. And as I mentioned last week, there are only the vaguest of hints in the Old Testament of an angelic role in the giving of the Mosaic Law. You see that in Deuteronomy 33:2 and in Psalm 68:17, although some dispute that it's even there. But it clearly was accepted as the truth in the intertestamental period. You had in non-biblical Jewish writings, like the book of Jubilees, you see it's clearly understood by Josephus, a first century Jewish writer. But most importantly, the Spirit of God acknowledges that that is the truth. What was understood by the Jews in the intertestamental period that they had picked up, you can say, well, is that just a tradition that they had messed up and gotten wrong? Well, they believe that, and they got it right. And you say, well, how do you know it got it right? Because the Spirit of God makes it clear in the New Testament. For example, here in Acts 7:37 and 38, he says, this is the Moses who said to the Israelites, God will raise up for you a prophet like me from your brothers. This is the one who was in the congregation in the wilderness with the angel who spoke to him at Mount Sinai. And with our fathers, he received living oracles to give to us. And then in verse 53, you who received the law as delivered by angels. And my screen just went dark. I'll click it and see if map came back on, you see. And then you see, Paul says in Galatians 3:19, why then the law? It was added for the sake of transgressions until the seed to whom it has been promised should come, having been ordained through angels by the hand of a mediator. So we see that this is in fact right, and that's what's being referred to there when the Hebrew writer says, look, if the word spoken by angels, every disobedience of that received punishment, well, then you can be sure that you're falling away and you're rejecting the truth that has been revealed by one greater than any angel. You're not going to escape. So he says the message of salvation came initially, the message of salvation came initially from Jesus and was confirmed to the author, the Hebrew writer, and to those to whom he's writing by those who heard Jesus. He's talking about the apostles. So here it comes, this revelation of God comes from God incarnate here, and he reveals these tremendous truths that he reveals to the apostles, and then the author of Hebrews and his audience receives that message from those who received it from Jesus. So though that message was prophesied, of course the gospel message was prophesied in the Old Testament, it wasn't until Jesus that that message was proclaimed as something that had in fact arrived. Right? So you have it being pointed to in the Old Testament, but with Jesus now, it has come with Jesus' appearance. So the Savior, the basis of God's forgiveness, the coming promised Messiah had arrived. He had appeared in human history. And people now are called to respond to that historical appearance. So Jesus has been here. He's been crucified, raised from the dead, and that's a major thing, right, in the history of salvation. So the author and his readers, they were what we would call second-hand Christians. You could say second generation, but that gives the idea of time, and I don't think that's what he's talking about. They're second-hand Christians in the sense they receive the word from those who got that word from Jesus, rather than receiving that word directly from Jesus themselves. And then he says that word that they received from those who had received it from Jesus, it was confirmed by those who heard Jesus. So the apostles who get this message from the Lord, straight from the Lord, had delivered this message to them, and they confirmed that message to the writer and to his original audience, meaning that they guaranteed the accuracy and the faithfulness of the message that they were delivering. And since that message that they are accurately and faithfully delivering, that they guarantee is accurate and faithful, was from Jesus, the Son of God, well, then we're certain that it's true, because they are vouching for the fact that they have delivered it with fidelity. And so this is what he's talking about. I said I was going to mess with you guys when you came in here, you see. All right. So God himself, he says, he also confirmed the truth of that message. So not only was it confirmed to them by those who delivered it to them, who had received it directly from Jesus, they vouched for what they were saying, but he says it was also confirmed to the original hearers by the various miracles and miraculous manifestations that accompanied the apostles' preaching. Right? So you have here the people who get the message from Jesus and who are delivering and who are vouching for it and saying we're delivering this accurately and faithfully. That was also confirmed by God in allowing them to do miracles. So that was his seal of approval, saying to them, this message is from me. So that's confirming function, you see. And I used to use the example of those guys. Dylan had told my grandson Dylan had told me about Dude Perfect. I don't know, they probably aren't even around anymore. But they would do all these great feats and stunts and everything, and they would video record them. And so once they video record them, they didn't have to keep doing the stunts over and over. And I look at that as how the miracles function to confirm that God is with the apostles in the truth. And then he records the performance of those miracles inerrantly in the Word, and having recorded it, he doesn't have to keep doing the miracles to confirm that, because he has the inerrant recorded message that you can go to and look. So the Dude Perfect people don't have to keep doing it. They just say, go look. And that's how I think that operates and works. But you see the confirming miracles functioning as confirmation just in the New Testament. You can see that this has that, and you could also see it in the Old Testament, but I didn't go back and dig through that. Now, in chapter 2, verses 5 to 9, so we're looking at 1 to 4. Now, in 5 to 9, in that section, he resumes the exposition on Christ. Okay, he resumes that exposition that he was giving in chapter 1, verses 5 through 14, that he then interrupted, so to speak, in chapter 2, verses 1 to 4, where he gave this section of exhortation. So you remember, Hebrews is exposition with sections of exhortation sprinkled in or interspersed. So we got the first one there in chapter 2, verses 1 to 4, where he warns them, he exhorts them. So in 2, 5 through 9, in this section, the author here, he introduces Psalm 8, verses 4 through 6. And that psalm, those verses contain elements of both exaltation and incarnation. And so this section coming up 5 to 9, it serves as a transition, okay, to the prior focus in this exposition that he's given, this prior focus there on the status of the Son, the exalted status, that he was raised and seated to his right hand. So it's a transition from that to what we're going to see in verses 10 through 18, where we have the focus on the Son's solidarity with humanity. Okay, so focus was exaltation. The focus is going to be on his solidarity with humanity. And here we have kind of a transition here, which has both elements. That Psalm 8, 4 to 6 has both elements of exaltation and incarnation. So that's how it functions that. So here we go in 2, 5 to 9. He says, for he did not subject to angels the coming world, concerning which we are speaking, but someone solemnly testified somewhere, Psalm 8, you see, saying, what is man that you're mindful of him, or the son of man that you are concerned for him? You made him for a little while lower than angels. You crowned him with glory and honor. You subjected all things under his feet. For in subjecting all things to him, he left nothing that is not subjected to him. But now we do not yet see all things subjected to him. But we see the one who for a little while was made lower than the angels, Jesus, having been crowned with glory and honor because of the suffering of death, so that by the grace of God he might taste death on behalf of everyone. So the fact that was noted in chapter 1, verse 13, that God never said to any angel that he would make his enemies a footstool for his feet. That fact is reflected here in chapter 2, verse 5, in the statement that God did not subject to angels the coming world. That is the world about which he was speaking in chapter 1, verses 11 and 12. See, the eternal world that will continue after this world as presently constituted. This world, this fallen world that is subject to corruption and decay. Well, after that world passes in the sense of being transformed into the eternal state, after it's brought to an end at the return of Christ. He did not subject that world to angels. And at that time, when Jesus returns, what is going to happen? Well, we know that every being shall kneel not in honor of some angel. You see, that's not what's going to happen, right? But in honor of Jesus' name. And every tongue is going to openly declare that Jesus is Lord. That's what Paul says in Philippians chapter 2, verses 9 through 11. And on the part of some, of course, that's going to be a forced reverence. It's going to be a submission to one whose power they simply can't resist. They hate him and all that, but when he comes, they're going to bow. Right? They're going to bow. F.F. Bruce, in his commentary on Philippians, he says, not only human beings, but also angels and demons, in joyful spontaneity or in reluctant fear, acknowledge the sovereignty of the crucified one. All beings, in fact, in heaven, on earth, and in the world below. There's going to be nobody styling in front of the Lord. Nobody's just in there saying, hey, you're not that tough. No. Everybody's bowing, baby. You see, he's that awesome. He's that powerful. You see, so he's that way. Now, Psalm 8, verses 4 through 6, which the writer cites, that refers not only to the Son's supreme exaltation that he's made clear. It refers not only to that, but also to a brief time when the Son, he comes and he takes his status or position as a human that was lower than that of the angels, and that he subjected himself to human authority. He put himself under human authority and let them crucify him. So he was made lower than the angels, and that's part of this transition going to 2:10 to 18, where the author is then going to focus on the incarnation. Okay, so he makes himself lower there, and then he says, he says there's tension, right? There's tension between the fact that Jesus has already been exalted as Lord over all, right? He's crucified, he's raised, he's ascended to heaven, he's seated at the right hand, King of kings and Lord of lords. He is Israel's Messiah, the Davidic king who has been crowned, right? And he sits on that throne. So there's tension between that and the fact that some things, right, like death, are not yet subjected to him. You see in 1 Corinthians 15, 26 to 28, right? Not yet subjected to him. And this tension, you see, it's reflected in the Psalms that the Hebrew writer cites. You see it in Psalm 110:1, in the Masoretic text. In 110:1, of course, he cites the Septuagint, which has a different reference. But in Psalm 110:1, which was cited in chapter 1, verse 13, he alludes to a future subjugation of all things to Christ, right? He says, seated at his right hand, until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet. So he's seated at the right hand until, you see. So this is the idea that we have this not yet. Until I make enemies a footstool. Whereas Psalm, so that's Psalm 110:1, but Psalm 8:4-6 suggests that the subjugation of all things to Christ is an accomplished fact. Right? Where he says here, you subjected everything under his feet. Right? So there's this tension here, and this is what the author is clarifying, this relationship. And I like the way that George Guthrie explains what he's doing here, the commentator. Guthrie says, the author, in effect, answers the question, which is it? Have all things been subjugated to the Son? Or does his universal dominance lie in the future? Is it past or is it future? Well, he answers that question with both. Okay? At various points, early Christian teachers present Christ's exaltation over the powers as a fait accompli, something that has already happened. This accomplished fact, however, might seem confusing at best and tacitly absurd at worst to someone looking at a church ravished by the forces of darkness. Persecuted Christians in Rome may have been asking, why are we being hurt by powers already placed under the feet of Christ? Has God not subjected all things to the Son? The author, referring to Psalm 8, answers this question in the affirmative, but based on Psalm 110:1, goes on to explain we have yet to see the full impact of his authority. This latter point aligns with other exaltation passages in the New Testament, which also, based on Psalm 110:1, speak of the subjugation of all things as a future event. And they're citing 1 Corinthians 15:25 and 26. This tension between the now and the not yet, if you've been in my classes for any length of time, you have heard me talk about this. I have talked about, and I say that because it is a fundamental aspect of New Testament theology. Okay? It's not a sidelight. It is part of how to understand what God is revealing to us. But he says this tension between the now and the not yet, between what is present reality but not yet seen, expresses what may be referred to as the inaugurated rule of Christ. That is, the reign of Christ and the reality of Christian experience have begun, but will not be fully actualized until a final consummation at the end of the age. The Son's rule is already a reality. He's on the throne. He's ruling. He inaugurated the kingdom. It is broken into this present age. He says that reality, however, must be confessed by faith until we see its full impact at the end of the age. So it is at the return of Christ. You see, so we live in this overlap of ages where the kingdom is a present reality, but it is not currently the sole reality. It overlaps until the return of Christ with all of the fallenness. That's why we still look around and see death and mourning and sorrow and crying and pain. But when he returns, all that is contrary to that eternal vision of Christ will be stripped out, and the kingdom of God will be the sole reality. That is the reality in which there'll be no death, no mourning, no crying, no pain. You see? But until then, you and I live in this overlap of ages. So I just like the way that Guthrie says that. Though we don't yet see the final subjugation of all things to Jesus, he says we see, meaning that we are aware of through the gospel. Okay? We see Jesus, who has been crowned with honor and glory because he became a human subject to human authority. In other words, he was made lower than the angels in that sense. He is divine. He is God, so in nature he is far superior. But he's talking about in the incarnation, he becomes a man who subjects himself to human authority, and in that sense he's made lower than the angels. And he died as a sacrifice for humanity's sins. So that the reference to Christ tasting death on behalf of mankind, that then leads into the next unit, which deals with the Son's suffering on behalf of the heirs. Okay, so here he says, so that by the grace of God he might taste death on behalf of everyone. So then in 2:10-18, for it was fitting for him, on account of whom are all things and through whom are all things, in bringing many sons to glory, to perfect the author of their salvation through sufferings. For both the one who sanctifies and those being sanctified are all of one, on account of which reason he is not ashamed to call them brothers, saying, I will proclaim your name to my brothers in the midst of the assembly. I will sing praises to you. And again, I will have confidence in him. And again, here am I and the children God gave me. Since therefore the children have shared blood and flesh, I preserve the order there. Normally we would say flesh and blood. Since the children have shared blood and flesh, he also likewise shared the same things, so that through death he might nullify the one having the power of death, that is the devil, and free these as many as were held in slavery by fear of death through all their living or all their lives. For clearly he's not concerned about angels, rather he's concerned about the descendants of Abraham, for which reason he was obligated to become like the brothers in every respect, so that he might become a merciful and faithful high priest in the things pertaining to God, in order to make atonement for the sins of the people. For because he has suffered, having been tested himself, he is able to help those being tested. And you remember the circumstance. He's writing to these Christians in Rome, these Jewish Christians, who are being tempted to abandon their faith and turn back to their former loyalties of Judaism. So having mentioned Jesus' death on behalf of mankind there in verse 9, the writer proclaims that it was fitting, it was proper, it was right, it was appropriate for God to save people, to bring many sons to glory through the means of Jesus' death. That was fitting and appropriate for God to do that. And it was fitting and appropriate for God to do that, to bring many sons to glory, to save many people through Jesus' death, because that way of saving people is in keeping with Jesus, with God's nature. It is in keeping with his nature, because God is absolutely, and we can't fathom this, he is absolutely holy and glorious. He is atomic white. Because he's absolutely holy and glorious, he cannot simply wink at sin. He cannot treat sin as though it's no big deal. To forgive sin without payment of a penalty would be to condone evil. It would be to trivialize it, and it would open God to the charge of being unjust, right? If you did that, yes, you would be exercising mercy, but you would be doing so at the expense of justice. And the example I often use is Timothy McVeigh. So Timothy McVeigh, you know, the guy who was the Oklahoma City bomber, who blew up that federal building and killed 168 people, including 19 kids, and injured 684 other people. So we imagine that he comes before a judge. He's been charged, and he comes before the judge, and the judge says, yes, you did all these things. And he says, okay, suspended sentence. Go ahead. Now, what would the reaction of people be? Would everyone praise the judge for his great mercy? I'm telling you, the judge would be driven out, because they would have understood that he had exercised, yes, he'd exercised mercy, but he'd done so at the expense of justice. You see, so that's what's going on. So regarding our sin, you see that there is tension between aspects of God's nature, between his justice and his mercy, between his holiness and his love. But that tension is not irreconcilable. There's tension in his nature, but it's not irreconcilable. And the cross, you see, the cross is where God's justice and mercy, it's where his holiness and his love are manifested simultaneously. You see, it is there in the cross. The cross is where that happens, because in his love, God desires to forgive us our sin. He sent Jesus, right, to take upon himself the punishment for that sin. So he didn't wink at it. He didn't trivialize the sin. He didn't condone the sin. Far from it, he bore the sin in himself. He took the sin on himself. He bore it. So in the cross, you see, God is then able to satisfy both his holiness and his love. In other words, through the cross, he's able to forgive in a way consistently with his being. He is able to forgive justly. He is able to forgive righteously. And that's why it was fitting or appropriate or right for God to save people through the means of Jesus' death. And this is what the author's saying. So when the writer says it was fitting for God to, then when he says to perfect the author of their salvation through sufferings, meaning through his death, all that was involved in his death, which was horrific. When he says that, he's not suggesting that Jesus was ever imperfect. You see, he sits here and he says, to perfect the author of their salvation, that's Jesus, through his sufferings, through his death. He's not suggesting that he was ever imperfect in the sense of being flawed or in the sense of being errant. He's not saying that at all. God perfected Jesus through his death in the sense that was the act that fulfilled or completed the plan of redemption. So like Jesus sinlessly and flawlessly fulfilled his mission at every step. He was perfect in that. But that mission, it wasn't completed, right, until his death on the cross. And of course, what follows from that is resurrection and ascension. But this is the ultimate event here. So it was in process, but it wasn't completed until he endured that. So until that time, Jesus' obedience, it was not yet perfect in the sense it was not yet complete. And the rough analogy that I use to try to help people to understand how can that be is bowling, right? You think about somebody who's bowled all strikes for 9 frames. Okay, well, that person there, he's flawless to that point, right? He's all strikes for 9 frames, but there's a sense, right, in which his perfection is not yet complete. It's not until the game is finished, until the intended end is reached, that he is perfect in a deeper and fuller way. And that's so certainly Jesus is not flawed or errant or anything like that. Then both Jesus and those who are sanctified by his atoning death, they all share the same Father. Right? They all share the same Father. They are all sons and daughters of God. Right? That's what we are as redeemed people. We are sons and daughters of God. And though Jesus is the Son, of course, in a unique sense, but he's the Son. And so we are sons and daughters of God. And for that reason, Jesus is not ashamed to call his disciples brothers. You see, he's the Son of God. We are all sons and daughters, so he's not ashamed to call us brothers. You see, and that's something great. So he's not ashamed. So however the society may reject them, and you can see how comforting this is. And when a world is looking at you and saying, you're disgraceful, we hate you, we're going to come after you, that Jesus is not ashamed to identify with them. Okay? I'm not part of that. I'm with you. I own you. I don't abandon you. Right? He's not ashamed to call them brothers. In support of the assertion that he's not ashamed to call his disciples brothers, the author quotes 3 Old Testament texts that he reveals that these texts are properly seen as prophecies about Jesus. So the Spirit of God in the writer of Hebrews, he reveals that these texts are properly seen as prophecies about Jesus. And the quotes are from Psalm 22:22, different versification in the Septuagint, 21:23, and Isaiah chapter 8, verses 17 to 18, although the second statement where he says, I will have confidence in him, that also appears in texts other than Isaiah 8:17. But he's appealing to these texts and letting us know that these are rightly understood, see, as prophecies about Jesus. In Psalm 22, there's no surprise about that at all, right? I mean, Psalm 22 was understood clearly by first century Christians to be about Jesus. Isaiah chapter 8, verses 17 and 18, presumably they were understood messianically because Isaiah chapter 8, verse 14, describes the Lord as a stumbling stone. You see, it describes him as a stumbling stone, which words were applied to Christ by other New Testament writers. You see that in Romans 9:33 and 1 Peter 2:8. And because Isaiah's children, his children were considered signs and portents from God, which suggests that Isaiah 8:17 and 18 may have a significance lurking there beyond what is obvious. So here we have these statements being made, these texts are prophecies about Jesus, and these texts support that Jesus is not ashamed to call them brothers by reference to my brothers. Right, so that's obviously clear. How does it support that he's not ashamed to call them brothers? Because you have him in there saying my brothers. So that's clear, and it supports it by his close association with the children. Right, he's with them, and God gave them to him. So he has this close association with the children, and by his expressions of devotion to the Father, which stress his sonship, and therefore link him fraternally, horizontally with God's other sons and daughters. Okay, so this he's saying he's not ashamed to call them brothers, and he cites these texts as an indication that he's not ashamed to call them brothers. And there's uncertainty as to when does the writer of Hebrews understand Jesus to fulfill these texts. Because he says these are rightly seen as prophecies about Jesus. Jesus is saying these things. Well, when does he understand him to fulfill these texts? And that's just not clear, but that uncertainty about when he understands Jesus to have fulfilled these texts doesn't detract from his point. Right? Whatever uncertainty we have about that, it doesn't detract from his point. Now, whether these are statements that the Son made before his incarnation, before becoming the God-man Jesus, or whether it was statements he made during his earthly ministry, or whether it was statements he made after his ascension, or some combination thereof. Okay, we're just not told that. The fact he made them anywhere, at any time, that emphasizes, you see, the solidarity of the Son with the sons. And that's the point. You see, he's not ashamed to call them brothers. The writer wasn't concerned to spell out the timing and location of the sayings, because that wasn't key to his purpose. His purpose was to assure them, and he's not ashamed to identify with you in the midst of your struggling and you're being a part of a society that despises you. He's not there. He's not ashamed of you. You're his brothers. He's willing to call that out. Now, since the children of God are human, they're made of blood and flesh, the Son also became a human, he says, to nullify the devil's work. You see, he also took on flesh, became a human. He became a human being to conquer human mortality, to conquer the devil's work, to conquer death by providing resurrection life for the children of God, and as a result, to free them from their fear of death. Right? If you really understand, you see that death is simply this passage, right? That ultimately I'm going to be raised and live again, and even in the interim state, it's going to be a great thing, because it's better by far to go and be with Jesus in the intermediate state as a disembodied spirit awaiting the resurrection. Okay, so this is this thing, see, to free them from their fear of death. And the way he accomplished this nullification of the devil's work was through his own death. That's how he did it. It was through his own death. See, by his sacrifice for sin, he removed that which gives death its sting. By removing sin and the penalty of sin, he removed the thing that gives death its sting. He removed the thing that makes death painful. You see that in 1 Corinthians 15:56, right? Death without the yoke of sin. A death in which sin has been removed. Well, that's a passage into the glorious presence of Christ. Right? You see that in Acts chapter 7, verse 59. That's what Paul says in Philippians 1:23. To go and be with Christ, that's better by far. That's what I want. Why is that? Because he's going in there with the yoke of sin taken away. How did the yoke of sin get taken away? It got taken away through the death of Jesus Christ. That's how that got removed. So death is no longer to be feared. Right? It's no longer to be feared. The subtext of which is that the threat of death they may be presented with should not draw them away. Now, I know how hard that is. I remember John was talking to somebody. I think it was a Chinese fellow at ASU many years ago, and he was asking me, he said, would you die for Jesus? And the guy looked at him, he said, are you crazy? No. You see this idea, you see that this notion that death is not the end. Death is not the end. So he wants them to see, because they're going to be threatened to abandon Jesus. And he wants them to see that he has freed those who have lived under a fear of death by removing through his own death the thing that makes death painful. All right? Donald Hagner, in his commentary, he says, the devil has been defeated in principle in and through the ministry of Jesus, and especially through the cross, and yet he is not destroyed, but continues to have real, if limited, power. In a similar way, the New Testament can say Christ has destroyed death, and yet death continues to be a reality with which humanity must reckon. The devil and death are clearly overcome in Christ's work, even if in this interim period between the cross and the return of Christ, we do not see the full effects of Christ's victory. In other words, people still die. Right? Death remains an enemy. That's how it is in this world between Jesus' inauguration and the consummation of the kingdom. But the day is coming when that will no longer be true. The day is coming when there's going to be resurrection life, when we're going to the creation, fallen and corrupt creation is getting the ultimate makeover. The new heaven and the new earth, we will live eternally there. Death will no longer, there'll be no more death, no mourning, no crying, no pain. That perfect place. And people say, I'm afraid I'm going to get bored. You're not getting bored. Okay? You're not getting bored. Going to be plenty to do, experience, all of these things. That caricature you see that has been around a long time, you're just going to be a non-material thing just kind of floating around. It's just not right. It's not biblical. You see, it's not biblical. It's not that. So, now as these Christians well understood Jesus' sacrifice on the cross, you see, it was not about angels, right? They weren't the focus of this, but it was people, and specifically he puts it was about the descendants of Abraham in the sense of those you see who come to faith in Christ. The faith descendants of Abraham, right? The church is, of course, Jewish at its root and nucleus, but it includes Gentiles who are descendants of Abraham in the sense they share Abraham's faith, and therefore we are grafted into the Israel root of the church. You see? So we are the new Israel. Okay? So this is what he's talking about. When he's saying this, the descendants of Abraham, it is for those people, all people who will come to faith in Jesus Christ, and in that express the faith of Abraham, who trusted God, and therefore we trust God like Abraham would, and that we believe God when he tells us who Jesus is. I'm over time. Thanks for coming.